This is a standard motif in temperance images, which is basically the sort of arc of the career of the alcoholic. You start out just tippling slightly, occasionally a drink with dinner, eventually affects your work, you eventually start beating your wife, mistreating your children, you lose your job, you become unemployed, and you eventually end up being a derelict on the street and you die. That's sort of the general arc. It's basically a standard morality story that was presented and published and distributed quite widely in the United States. Alcohol in the 19th century is rampant. Certainly in cities, saloons are all over the place. The temperance movement is certainly concerned about alcohol abuse, the ramifications of the abuse of liquor on the family, on work, and so on and so forth.
I don't think that many people realize that Susan B. Anthony was a leader in the temperance movement. The temperance movement was all about men's behavior, by the way. It wasn't not just alcohol. It was the abuse of alcohol and the beating of women by drunken men. And they would also spend an inordinate amount of money on it, and on payday, they go to the bars, and what would be left for the wife and the kids? So there was a whole movement to restrict alcohol.
As the city of Lowell came into being, Americans were drinking more alcohol than ever before. In this climate, some early Llewellyans started taking temperance pledges and forming societies to encourage total abstinence from alcohol. Through groups such as the Coldwater Army, some women used the temperance movement as an outlet for power and organizing. In later years, temperance groups were also often aligned with suffrage clubs. In Lowell, the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Equal Suffrage League were neighbors and allies. Temperance finally had its day on January 16, 1919, when the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified. Most people rejected the idea of a dry society, and prohibition was repealed in 1933. Nonetheless, Americans today, on average, drink less than a third of what they did in 1830.
On January 17, 1920, 6 armed men robbed a Chicago freight train. But it wasn't money they were after. Less than 1 hour after spirits had become illegal throughout the United States, the robbers made off with thousands of dollars worth of whiskey. It was a first taste of the unintended consequences of Prohibition. The nationwide ban on the production and sale of alcohol in the United States came on the heels of a similar ban in Russia that started as a wartime measure during World War I. But the view in the Western world of alcohol as a primary cause of social ills was much older. It first gained traction during the Industrial Revolution as new populations of workers poured into cities and men gathered in saloons to drink. By the 19th century, anti-drinking groups called temperance movements began to appear in the United States and parts of Europe. Temperance groups believed that alcohol was the fundamental driver behind problems like poverty and domestic violence, and set out to convince governments of this. While some simply advocated moderate drinking, many believed alcohol should be banned entirely. These movements drew support from broad sectors of society. Women's organizations were active participants from the beginning, arguing that alcohol made men neglect their families and abuse their wives. Religious authorities, especially Protestants, denounced alcohol as leading to temptation and sin. Progressive labor activists believed alcohol consumption harmed workers' ability to organize.